You have spoken before about the emergence of consciousness in terms of evolution, and I was wondering, how do you feel about the old debate of whether or not animals have souls, or to what degree they partake in universal consciousness?
Let's start off with consciousness. Um, keeping in mind what I said earlier, that ultimately this deep proto-consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, really is the core of everything, matter, spirit, etc. But let's just use consciousness sort of in the more conventional fashion as being aware of the environment and having agency, being able to do something. So awareness and agency, let's just take that. Now, if we consider that as manifestations of consciousness, many things can appear to have consciousness. A single cell will be able to make decisions as to which way it wants to move and whether it wants to eat something or not. And there's some really fascinating videos. Mike Levin at Tufts University in the United States has done some beautiful work looking at consciousness at different levels. In other words, single cells. And then when the cells come together and organize themselves, it's as if this new organization has a different level of consciousness and response. And so it goes on. I think there's an important transition when we come to awareness of self-consciousness, being aware of oneself as not just an individual, but certainly being aware of oneself, or consciousness of self. That to me is an important transition. And you might say, well, is it just in humans that occurs? Well, first of all, you can have a situation where humans have apparently awareness and agency, but no consciousness. And there's a condition known as absence automatism, or petit mal automatism. It's a form of epilepsy where, in a sense, all the usual brain programs for responding to the environment and acting still are there, but the person is not there. The networks of brain activity that are responsible for manifesting of consciousness are disrupted. And there was a fascinating example that I read many years ago of a concert pianist who suffered from this absence or petit mal automatism. And his mother would know when he was practicing, he would practice many hours a day. She would know when he was having an absence attack, because there would be a pause in the playing, in the practicing, and then it would continue. But it was much more mechanical, the playing, without the sort of feeling. But he had all the senses, etc., but he wasn't there in a sense, even though, there was the behavior, etc. Now, that was a very high level of automatism. So the point I'm making is that you need this. There is this extra thing to allow for a level of consciousness. The issue of consciousness is now a really big topic in neuroscience, which is great, because years ago when I started, it was a forgotten. You don't talk about consciousness then. So there's been a sort of a huge improvement in that respect. However, some theories as to what needs to occur for consciousness to manifest have been proposed, and I don't want to go into those now. Tononi and his theory of integrated information is one theory, which is probably one of the more popular ones. But I suspect that all of these processes manifest consciousness, but there is that individual sense of self-consciousness, which emerges, I think, from that deep self that I mentioned earlier, the being of light that was referred to during the near-death experience. Whether you call it the soul or what, I don't know. But there is a deeper aspect of ourselves which manifests from life to life as the personality and the unique brain experience, DNA, etc. But that is the sort of thing that differentiates us from other life forms. At which, now you might say, well, at what point do you have this self-awareness? You know, humans have it. Okay, humans definitely have it. Do all humans have it? I don't know. If you look at people in a terminal state of dementia, do they have it? Probably, maybe not. I think it's still there at a different level, but it maybe cannot manifest. Although, interestingly, there is a phenomenon known as terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity. That's where the brain can be really very, very damaged due to dementia or injury or cancer, and the person appears to be unresponsive and in fact, just incontinent, just in a sort of terminal state. And yet, a few hours or maybe even a day or two before death, they seem to come good, and they have access to their memories again. They can recognize their relatives, etc. But it's only for a short time. It's just before death. And I'm speculating on what actually happens. And I think that near that stage there, in a sense, that people are accessing not the memories directly of the brain, but the memories of the self. Because remember, what we call ourself, the one that, for example, the non-physical aspect, the one that experiences the near-death experience, it has memories as well, because it can remember what it saw during the near-death state and comes back. So I think what's happening during some of these paradoxical or terminal lucidity is you're accessing these memories that come from consciousness, from the non-physical aspect, which I think occurs under a specific state. So, but I've just distracted myself. So let's just go back to the issue of consciousness. So if there is this deeper self, what some people have called the deep self as opposed to the personality, humans have it, yes. What about animals? Well, monkeys and primates, maybe there's some, maybe. But what about more primitive primates? Well, what about cats and dogs? Well, many people feel that they do. I don't know. But what about going down? What about a hedgehog? What about a platypus? What about a worm, a bacteria? At some point, is there a line? What I have read is that many of these things do exhibit consciousness, but more it's a group consciousness. So, for example, it might, when you look at a termite nest, in many ways, the termite nest as a whole, or the termite colony, seems to experience a form of group consciousness. So each individual ant maybe has a level of consciousness, but there's also another one as well, which is a group consciousness, which is nevertheless not associated with these deep self. One theory is that at some particular point, once the brain reaches a level of complexity where this deep self can manifest as an individual, then it occurs. And people refer to, I'm certainly familiar with things like the theosophical literature, which is related to some of the anthroposophical literature, where there's this notion that at a particular state, there is this interaction between this deep self, which may have existed forever, or it sort of came into existence at a certain point of time, I have no idea, and the brain, and from then on, there is continuing reincarnative experience. So this sort of transition between group consciousness and a point where individual consciousness can manifest is dependent on having a vehicle through which to manifest, which we're now here. It's the brain, but there could be other forms through which it can manifest. So I think all, not just life, but in fact all existence is a manifestation of this deep consciousness, and therefore has an aspect of consciousness. There is something different that occurs at a point where reflective self occurs. I don't think that's the end of the story. I think that's just one stage, because I think there are higher and higher levels, etc. But I'm speculating now. I don't know that for sure, but it makes sense to me. This notion of spiritual evolution as a successive expansion, to me, makes sense. I think that's probably much of what I can say about that question, which is a huge question, and it's a fascinating one. It's one I've thought about a lot without necessarily coming to any good answers.
The work you do is so very important for so many people, so many families, for the future of science. And we want to thank you so much for your time today. And enjoy your holidays.
Thank you. Look, I've enjoyed it. I think what you are doing is wonderful. I think it's an important, essentially, I think it's a crucial development. It's the way of the future.